The first hit wasn't a drum. It was light. A sheet of white brilliance cracked across Wembley Stadium, and 70,000 voices detonated at once. The stage, metal, truss, scaffolding, smoke, rose like a ship's prow over a living ocean. Cameras swarmed. Screens the size of small buildings bloomed with grain, then color, then the figure everyone had come to see. Michael Jackson. Not a rumor, not a record, not a poster in a bedroom. Michael Jackson in a black military jacket edged with gold. White tee beneath, hair damp and restless in the heat, glove catching shards of light and flicking them back into the sky. The band dropped into the pulse, that unmistakable shimmer and throb of a song the crowd knew down to its cellular memory. A curtain of lasers combed the air. The deck under his boots vibrated with sub-bass you could feel in your teeth. Everything was working. The choreography, the cues, the oxygen of a stadium in sync. And then almost nothing. A catch, a breath, something small and human, in a machine built to be enormous. Michael Jackson's gaze had locked on a place where the barricade curved toward the stage, just left of center. It was there in the flood of faces, signs, and raised arms that he saw her. At first, she was just a movement out of time, someone still while everyone else shook. A teenage girl, hair pulled back, cheeks streaked, clutching a laminated sign to her chest as if it were both armor and confession. The sign had hand-cut letters edged in glitter. The edges had softened in the crush, but the words were still legible. You saved my life. He missed a syllable. No one would have heard it if they weren't listening for it, but the band leader heard it. The man by the monitor desk heard it. The dancers, thick with sweat and muscle memory, felt the air shift. You don't build shows as big without learning to hear the smallest things. Michael Jackson sang through it, the way a pilot handles sudden crosswind. Wembley was a galaxy of phones and faces. The crowd sang back the chorus, so loudly it felt like scaffolding. He scanned the barricade again, as if to make sure it wasn't a trick of light. She was still there, not screaming, not fainting, crying, not joy crying, pain. A face turned up to him like a question that didn't have words. On the camera platform in front of house, a broadcast operator zoomed tight. The image of her hit the side screens, only for a second before the director cut away to a safer wide, but long enough to register. In the pit, a security guard's eyes followed the line of Michael Jackson's focus. Backstage left, a stage manager held a cue card he would not need now. The stadium didn't know yet, but the show knew. Michael Jackson shifted the mic from right to left. It was a small, habitual touch, something he did when moving between choreography and presence. He sidestepped his next mark, opened the distance between himself and the dancers without breaking time, and walked forward into the light until it carved a pale edge down the left side of his face. Another hit. The stadium roared. But the roar moved around him, like wind around a fixed stone. He saw the sign again. The letters weren't neat. Glue showed through the glitter. The lamination, bubbled and imperfect, had trapped tiny pockets of air, like a constellation of mistakes. There was a smudge of ink where a thumb had pressed too hard. The imperfection made it more true. He sang a line that has comforted millions, and for once it sounded like a question he was asking himself. You are not alone. If you have never stood on a stage that large, it is hard to understand how small it can feel. The lights blind. The speakers throw your own voice back at you like a wave. You learn to feel your way through a show by heat and outline and the movement of air. And sometimes, rarely, there's a thread between you and one person you can't break without lying. He moved to the very lip of the stage. The pit, press, photographers, security compressed toward each other like breath pulled in. The sign tilted up, hands trembling. Fans closest to the barricade reached with open palms for anything. A glance, a glove, the hem of the sleeve, proof that the distance between myth and skin can be less than a hand's width. He lowered the mic. Not down, just lower. The music director saw it. Hold, he said, low into his talkback. Not to stop the band, not yet, but to let them know they were on a wire. Keys laid off an accent. Drums softened the ghost notes. Guitar stayed in but let the pick whisper more than bite. It was still the song, but the song had leaned in to listen. A dancer coming out of spin stayed out of Michael Jackson's line. Instinct over instruction. On the downstage left wing, a tech with a coil of cable froze in the shadow, eyes bright white in the dark. Crisp and ear click, 2, 3, 4. Michael Jackson didn't come in. He held the line like a held breath, let the crowd carry the melody for him, and took 2 more steps until the angle made the barricade close to touch. Security moved, then stopped at a small flick of his fingers. The smallest choreography was always the most important. His gloved hand lifted, slow, asking, not commanding. The girl's hands answered, shaking. A sound started moving through the audience, a hush that isn't silence so much as expectation becoming delicate. Tens of thousands of people who had paid for spectacle felt something else entirely. Privacy, somehow, inside an arena. From the wings, a voice on comm. Do we have a lift? We got a lift? Confirm. If he brings her, standby medical. A reply. Copy. On your go. None of it touched the moment. The machine of the show kept the machine of the show from touching them. She had told herself she would not cry. She had bought a cheap poncho and a train ticket and had stood in the queue for 6 hours humming songs under her breath the way people recite prayers when they are late and traffic is unkind. She had decided not to be dramatic because it wasn't his job to fix her life. She had decided simply to be there because sometimes being there is all you can do. Now, here, it felt as if all the sadness she had been carrying had come up into her face at once. She didn't want this. She didn't want to be seen. But she also wanted exactly this. Someone to look at her and understand what the sign meant. You saved my life. What she meant was, your music kept me company when I thought no one would. What she meant was, the first time I heard your voice, the room got lighter. What she meant was, I am still here. She reached up because the hand reached down. The glove was cool and dry. When it closed around her fingers, it didn't pull. It steadied. The crowd surged and pressed and was immediately held back by a palm to chest from the nearest guard, who did not know he could be this gentle. Michael Jackson leaned in. The cameras knew better than to zoom tight. The director took a wide, then cut to silhouette, letting the side screen show light, not faces. The band thinned further, like a tide stepping back from the sand. He said something no one could hear. It wasn't for them. He could have kept singing. He could have nodded with compassion and moved on, sheltering the moment inside the choreography as if the show were the safer love. He could have put the mask back on. Instead, he did something he'd been told 1,000 times never to do. He stopped. The word stop doesn't look like a miracle. In a stadium show, it looks like risk. It looks like dead air and lawsuits and timing wrecked, and a million living molecules of energy suddenly deprived of their oxygen. It looks like the most famous entertainer, alive, deciding that a thing no one paid for is the most important thing in the world. He stepped away from his mark and lifted his free hand. Just a fraction, just enough. In the music director's ear. Kill. Kill soft. Hold on me. The next downbeat did not arrive. The band bled to a whisper over 2 bars, then fell to pads and air. The dancers slid into stillness, hearts pounding, bodies coiled and ready. But the cue did not come. The sound that followed was impossible. Wembley Stadium, 70,000 people, became quiet enough to hear the distant whir of follow spot head adjusting 3 degrees. You could hear the little hiss the pyros make when they're armed but not yet ignited. You could hear a woman in row 38 gasp and then press her hand to her mouth. You could hear the jingle of a single charm bracelet near the barricade as someone's arm trembled. And somewhere in the center of all that, you could hear a teenager breathing. Michael Jackson closed the last sliver of distance and crouched, carefully, so the light did not blind her, so the stage edge did not startle her, so the world did not rush at her all at once. He was smaller here, in this angle and posture. No longer tower, no longer screens, no longer noise, just a person with his knees bending and his spine curving. The most famous spine in the world in the simplest human shape. His ungloved hand, left, came up and rested over his heart. The right hand, gloved, still held hers. He tipped his head in that way he had of making an arena feel like a room, and a room feel like 2 chairs turned toward each other. He didn't say anything yet. You don't speak into a miracle until you've listened to it. The stadium held its breath a second longer. Try to understand what to do with so much gentleness inside so much iron and light. Backstage, a monitor tech wept without knowing why. A security captain muttered, I got him, to no one in particular, meaning not that he was physically in control of anything, but that he understood. On the risers, the choir, off-stage, mic'd, invisible, waited with hands folded like children instructed to be good for just one more minute. The MD kept his palm hovering over the downbeat that would not come. A dancer looked at the floor and let his lungs decide the tempo of the universe. Michael Jackson leaned in, just a little more, lips close to the mic, and said the first words he had spoken that were not lyrics. Hold on. It was not a command to band. It was to her. He turned the mic head away from their faces. It was a tiny thing, a pro's trick, to keep the sound of their private breath from becoming public. It meant he would have to speak louder if he wanted the stadium to hear him. He didn't. Not yet. The front barricade, steel, paint chipped beneath black, was warm from the press of people. The girl's sign had slipped to her elbow. She did not try to lift it again. She didn't need to. Hold on, he repeated. Softer now. A second not meant for the speakers. A second meant for the body attached to these shaking fingers. He closed his eyes. If you were close enough to see, you saw his lips shape 3 words, almost not words at all, just a shape that a lifetime had made in his mouth. You are not. He didn't finish. Because finishing would be performance, and this was something else. On the big screen, the director held the wide. Stage a small island on a sea of night. One pool of light centered on a man who had decided that the only way to properly sing a line about loneliness was to stop singing it and prove it wrong instead. Far up in the stands, somebody who had come for the hits put their hand over their heart and discovered themselves crying. They would tell friends later that it happened like weather. Backstage, a runner with a headset waited with a small bottle of water and a towel no one would use. On the ramp, the ambulance team checked their bags, not because they expected anything, but because the job is to expect everything. In the lighting booth, a programmer held a cue stack he had practiced for months and let it sit, breathing with the room like it was a living thing. Because it was. On the stage, in the center of it all, Michael Jackson did something none of the equipment around him could do. He waited. The girl's shoulders eased by degrees, the kind of easing only someone looking exactly at her could notice. The fingers in the glove uncurled, then tightened again, not to hold on, but to say, thank you. Her face lifted, blotched, wet, honest. She tried to form words and failed and shook her head. A small, helpless apology for needing this badly in public. He shook his head back. No apology necessary, and gave her a look people would later try to describe with adjectives that always felt wrong. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even comfort. Not exactly. It was recognition, like for like. In the bowels of the stadium, fans who could not see any of this felt it anyway. The way a building feels a tremor in a beam you cannot point to. On the concourse, a vendor stopped mid-pour and stared up at a television, no longer telling him what to sell. In the nosebleeds, a girl who had spent 3 weeks arguing with her father about whether she could even come to this show put her head on her best friend's shoulder and understood something about permission that didn't have a word yet. Michael Jackson turned his head a fraction, and the mic came back toward his lips. He didn't stand. He stayed low, eye level, as if proximity were part of the music. A single pad held in the key of the song, not loud, not insisting, just a bed. The MD had left it there by instinct, like a hand at the small of a back. In the silence, it sounded like the world remembering the note it had been born in. Michael Jackson lifted the mic, let the mesh touch light, and drew breath. The band waited on him. The choir waited on him. The stadium waited on him. The world, at least the piece of it that had gathered here tonight, waited on him. And he did not give them music. Not yet. He gave them the last second of quiet before the decision. The silence leaned so far forward it almost fell. Then, as if a clock somewhere no one could see had ticked, Michael Jackson made the choice that would turn a concert into a story. He opened his mouth, and everything on earth held still. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. For a few heartbeats, the whole of Wembley existed in a pulse that didn't belong to music. It belonged to her. Later, People would argue about when exactly the concert changed, whether it was when the band softened, or when Michael's glove reached down, or when the crowd realized he wasn't acting. But for her, it had already changed the second his eyes found hers. One instant, she was another face in a sea of faces, sweat-damp hair sticking to her cheeks, half crushed against the barricade. The next, there was only light and him. Her name was Emily Carter, 19 years old, from a small town outside Manchester. She had arrived that morning on the first train, clutching a backpack filled with two things: a bottle of water and the sign she spent the night making on her bedroom floor. "You saved my life." The words looked childish to her now, the lettering uneven, the glitter clinging to her fingertips all day like tiny fragments of confession. She had meant to write more, something poetic, maybe a lyric, but nothing else had fit. Those 4 words were the only truth she could bear to bring. When she saw the white glove lift toward her, she froze. Every sound, drums, cheers, feedback, slid into distance, like someone had opened a door into silence. He was looking right at her, and she felt, absurdly, that he could read the story she'd never told. She had first heard his voice when she was 11. Her father had left 2 days earlier. Her mother hadn't come out of the bedroom since, and the house smelled like burnt toast. Emily had turned on the television just to fill the noise, and there he was, singing Man in the Mirror. That night she played the clip again and again, until her eyes blurred. It wasn't the lyrics that saved her at first. It was the tone. That voice carried something she didn't have words for then. The sound of someone promising that pain could still be beautiful. Years passed. School got crueler. Her body changed. Her friends didn't. The world built walls around her faster than she could find doors. She'd written letters to him she never sent, hundreds of them, tucked into a shoebox beneath her bed. Each began the same way. "You don't know me, but you made me feel seen." And tonight she had brought the box's truest sentence to life in cardboard and glue. When the lights dropped and the opening chords of You Are Not Alone began, she thought, "This is the song that raised me." Then he saw her. Now the words on the sign felt too small for what was happening. Michael stood at the edge of the stage, still crouched, breathing the same air as the crowd. But the crowd had vanished for both of them. He watched her mouth tremble as she tried to speak. All she could manage was a whisper that drowned in the hum of the amplifiers. "Thank you," 2 syllables. And somehow they carried every lonely night she'd survived. Michael felt something in his chest that wasn't part of choreography, a warmth and a tightening. He recognized it. He had felt it at 5 years old when his mother lifted him onto that Coca-Cola crate and told him he could do this. Back then it was love, terror, and wonder mixed together. Now it was the same, only heavier. He squeezed her hand gently once. "I hear you." She began to shake harder, overwhelmed not by fame, but by the impossibility of being noticed by the very person whose voice had once kept her alive. Her tears fell onto his glove. Tiny dark marks bloomed in the sequins, almost invisible unless you were close enough to see how human a symbol can become. He could hear his heartbeat inside the in-ear monitors. He could feel the entire production waiting behind him. Band, dancers, crew, thousands of dollars of machinery ticking down the seconds of silence. But none of it mattered. In front of him was a mirror, a girl whose pain looked too familiar. He saw himself at 12 backstage in some city he no longer remembered, cry because the lights hurt and he missed home, and his father's voice had said, "Don't you cry in front of people." He had learned to sing through tears, to hide every crack inside melody. Now he saw someone doing the opposite, crying because a melody had given her permission to. He wanted to tell her that he understood. He wanted to tell her that the gift people said saved them had nearly broken him, too. But words would have cheapened it. So he let silence do the talking. From the floor, Emily could see details she had never imagined. The faint shimmer of sweat on his temple, the soft tremor of his lip as he breathed, the tiny crescent moon scar near his wrist. He was real, and somehow that was even more impossible than if he weren't. The crowd behind her began to sway forward, arms pressed against her back. But the guards held the line. She didn't move. Couldn't. It felt like standing inside prayer. She tried to remember every second, afraid she would wake up and it would all dissolve into dream. The smell of ozone from the lights, the taste of salt on her lips. The way the bass still thumped faintly through the soles of her shoes, even though the song had stopped. Everything enormous had shrunk to one shared heartbeat. Michael lifted the mic again, not to sing but to speak. It was dangerous, unscripted, but the words came softly. "Hey, it's okay." The line carried through the speakers like a sigh across water. A murmur moved through the stadium. Half confusion, half reverence. Emily covered her mouth. He was talking to her. Michael leaned closer, voice lower now, nearly swallowed by the distance between the mic and his lips. "Don't cry. You're stronger than you think." The camera operators had already switched to wide shots. They knew instinctively this wasn't for broadcast close-ups. All that reached the big screens was silhouette. Two figures at the edge of light, one kneeling, one standing, their hands joined. To anyone in the back rows, it looked like a painting, something sacred rather than staged. But to her, it was the most ordinary, beautiful thing in the world. Someone seeing her and telling her she would be okay. She remembered the hospital, the cold smell of disinfectant, the nurse turning on a small radio to fill the silence. A song came through, "Heal the World." She had been 14, wrists bandaged, the air heavy with regret. That song had kept her alive long enough to start again. Now the same man who had sung it was holding her hand, and every part of her wanted to say thank you for that night, for every night, for the years that followed. But her voice wouldn't work. Only her tears could speak. Michael's eyes softened. He could see the history behind them without needing to ask. He understood that sometimes a fan's love wasn't worship. It was gratitude for survival. He wished he could take every hurt she carried and turn it into rhythm, into something that healed twice. Once for her, once for him. He wished he could stop being a symbol long enough just to be human with her. So he did. He took off the glove. The audience didn't notice at first. The movement was small, but she did. When his bare hand touched hers, she felt the warmth of living skin, not myth. He smiled, a quiet, almost shy curve of the mouth that said, "See? I'm just like you." That broke her. She sobbed, messy and uncontrolled. He squeezed her fingers, unashamed of the wetness in his own eyes. Around them, the world began to remember itself. The band still held the pad note. The lights still glowed. But nobody dared to break the spell. Michael looked at her once more, then spoke again, barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" Her throat tightened. She stammered, "Emily." He repeated it, softly, into the microphone so the crowd could hear. "Emily." A wave of murmurs moved through the stadium like wind through grass. To tens of thousands of strangers, that name suddenly meant something larger than itself. Michael turned slightly, speaking not to her now but to the crowd. "Sometimes people forget that we all need love, right?" The response was not the usual cheer. It was a sound closer to agreement, to gratitude. He looked back at her. "Thank you for reminding me." And then, because music was the only language big enough to hold what words couldn't, he lifted his hand toward the band and gave a single nod. The keyboardist caught it instantly. A new chord bloomed, soft and reverent. The drummer brushed the snare with the lightest touch, almost air. The opening of "Heal the World" flowed out like sunrise. Michael didn't stand yet. He stayed crouched, singing the first line directly to her. Think about the generations. The microphone trembled slightly in his hand. Her face was streaked, but she smiled through the tears. Every camera caught it, the moment when pain turned into something lighter. Security moved carefully, silently. A guard signaled. Permission to lift her over the barrier if he wanted. Michael nodded. Two hands helped Emily up. The crowd steadied her. For an instant, she floated above the rail, suspended between the ordinary world and something infinite. Then she was standing beside him on the stage. The stadium erupted, but the sound came from far away, like thunder behind glass. He held her hand, led her a few steps inward, and turned her so she could see what he saw. A sea of lights, thousands of tiny fires held up in the dark. "That's all love," he whispered. "All of that. For you. For everyone." She shook her head, overwhelmed. He smiled, eyes glistening. "Share it. Don't keep it inside." For the rest of the song, she didn't cry. She swayed beside him, her small voice joining his on the chorus. It didn't matter that she couldn't sing in tune. What mattered was that she was singing. When the final note faded, Michael looked at her again. He could have sent her back immediately, kept the show moving. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly to hers. Barely a touch, but enough to break every heart watching. He whispered something that microphones didn't catch. Later, she would repeat it to a reporter, voice shaking. He said, "Promise me you'll keep living." She nodded through tears. He smiled the soft, exhausted smile of someone who had given everything and found it worth it. Then he gestured to guard. They helped her down gently, back to her place in the crowd. As her feet touched the ground, the audience parted for her like water. Hands reached out, patting her shoulders, her back, as if she were carrying something holy. Michael turned toward the microphone again. The band was waiting. He lifted a hand to signal continue, but before the next cue hit, he said one last thing. Every show has a message. Tonight, she showed us what it really is. Applause, deafening and endless, but Emily barely heard it. She was trembling, smiling, weeping, all at once. The spot where he had held her hand still felt warm, as if the light itself had sunk beneath her skin. That night, when she finally left the stadium, she didn't take the train. She walked. The London air was cool against her face, and every streetlight looked like a star. In her backpack, the sign was damp and torn, glitter flaking away. She didn't care. It had already done its job. At a red light, she looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." No cameras, no music, no crowd. Just gratitude. Across town, in a hotel suite above the Thames, Michael sat alone for a moment before the crew came in. He set the glove he had removed on the table. The sequin still glistened where her tears had dried. He smiled to himself, quiet, tired, peaceful. He didn't need applause tonight. He'd already heard the truest sound of all, another heartbeat still going. The next morning, newspapers would describe it as a pause for compassion. TV anchors would call it the moment the king of pop turned a concert into church. But none of the reports captured what it had felt like. Because of the length of a single song, the entire idea of celebrity had vanished. There was only a man who saw someone hurting, and a girl who realized she wasn't invisible. And that realization echoed farther than any chord he played that night. Back in her room weeks later, Emily placed a ruined sign above her bed. The glitter was mostly gone, but under a strip of tape it still read, "You saved my life." She smiled at it, then at her reflection in the window. She whispered the correction she now understood. "No, you helped me save it myself." The stadium felt different after she stepped down. The air itself seemed fragile, as if the sound had been taken out of it. 70,000 people stood still, hands frozen in the glow of their phones, unsure whether to cheer or whisper. The floodlights pulsed slowly, dimming as if in sympathy. Michael stayed where he was, his silhouette caught in a cone of amber light. The sweat on his face glimmered like raindrops, and his breathing was audible even over the muted PA hum. The band waited for a cue that didn't come. Somewhere offstage, a guitar tech whispered, "Is he okay?" Nobody answered. From a control booth, the director watched his monitors in disbelief. The most rehearsed performer in the world had abandoned the script, and somehow it felt right. The sound engineer kept his finger hovering above the fader, afraid to break whatever this was. Michael's chest rose and fell. He could still feel the warmth of the girl's hand, the salt of her tears on his glove. The moment replayed itself behind his eyes. Her trembling smile, the cardboard sign, the way she looked at him not as a star, but as a person. That look had pierced straight through the armor he'd spent decades building. The lights, the costumes, the myth, suddenly they felt too heavy, like chains disguised as gold. A single camera zoomed in. The image hit the giant screens above the stage. Michael standing utterly still, his head slightly bowed, eyes unfocused. In the crowd, a small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mum, why isn't he singing?" She hushed him, but she didn't know either. None of them did. They only knew that whatever was happening felt sacred. Backstage, the production manager spoke softly into his headset. "Hold positions. No blackout. Let it breathe. The phrase passed through the crew like a prayer. Let it breathe. A ripple moved through the audience, a kind of collective awareness. The cheers that had filled the night, only minutes before dissolved into murmurs, then silence again. People began to lower their phones, realizing instinctively that this wasn't something to record. It was something to witness. Michael swallowed hard. For the first time in years, the noise in his head, management deadlines, expectations, faded. What replaced it was memory. His mother's voice humming hymns in their tiny house in Gary, Indiana. His father's stern eyes during rehearsals. The smell of sawdust on the stage floors he danced on since he was 5. All those echoes folded into the silence now pressing against him. He lifted the microphone halfway, then stopped. His hands shook. The tremor surprised him. 1,000 times he'd held that mic like a weapon, commanding crowds with ease. Tonight it felt like holding a mirror to his own soul. The first sob slipped out before he could stop it, a small, broken sound that the microphone caught and sent echoing through every speaker. It wasn't dramatic. It was human. The crowd reacted not with gasps but with stillness. A man in the front row instinctively took off his hat. A woman clasped her hands as if in church. High up in the stands, 2 friends looked at each other and started crying without knowing why. The band exchanged glances. The drummer mouthed, "What do we do?" The music director shook his head slowly. Wait. Michael's body trembled. His throat burned. The makeup beneath his eyes blurred under tears, streaking silver down his cheeks. He pressed his free hand to his chest and whispered, "I can't keep hiding." The words weren't meant for anyone, but they carried through the stillness, faint yet unmistakable. A security guard standing near the barrier felt his own throat tighten. He'd been working concerts for 20 years. He'd seen collapses, fights, chaos, but never this. He whispered to the guard beside him, "He's not breaking down. He's letting go." On the press platform, a journalist from Rolling Stone lowered his camera. He scribbled a single line in his notebook. "This is not performance. This is confession." In the lighting booth, an operator's hand hovered above the dimmer. He thought of bringing up the brightness, then hesitated. The moment didn't need more light. It needed honesty. The crowd began to move again, not toward the exits but toward each other. Strangers reached out, linking hands. It was as if the silence itself had a rhythm, slow and steady, beating through every chest. Michael closed his eyes. Images flashed through his mind. Hotel corridors, studio walls, endless travel, faces that smiled and disappeared. He saw his children's drawings taped to a refrigerator back home. The words "We love you, Daddy" scrawled in crayon. He saw headlines that twisted kindness into spectacle. He saw himself at 8, at 25, at 38, all the versions collapsing into one man standing alone in the light. He bent forward slightly, the mic lowering with him. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, tens of thousands of bodies moving as one organism. Then something happened. A sophom escaped him, just breath at first, then tone. It slid into melody, uncertain but pure. The note hung in the air like a fragile thread. The choir sensed it before anyone else. Without waiting for a signal, their voices joined his, low and haunting. The sound grew until it filled the space that silence had carved open. In the stands, the boy tugged his mother's sleeve again. "He's singing," he whispered, eyes wide. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Down by the barricade, the girl who had started it all, Emily, covered her mouth. She could hear her name echoing faintly in her head, the way he'd said it earlier. Around her, people began to sway, not dancing, just moving like waves to the rhythm of forgiveness. Michael opened his eyes. Through the blur of lights and tears, he saw them all, thousands of faces lifted toward him, shining not with adoration but with compassion. It hit him like a surge of electricity. The loneliness that had lived in him for years cracked open, replaced by something warm, almost unbearable. He whispered, "We all get hurt, but the love we give each other, that's what saves us." The words vibrated through the speakers and into hearts. The audience responded, soft at first, then louder. "We love you, Michael." The phrase grew until it was a roar, but not the usual frenzied scream. It was steady, reverent, unified. He smiled, trembling. I love you more, he said and meant it. Behind him, the music swelled. The orchestra caught the key of his improvised melody, strings rising like dawn over a dark horizon. The sound wrapped around him like arms. He lifted his head, inhaled deeply, and began to sing again. No choreography, no perfection, just voice. The camera zoomed in close enough to capture the tears glistening on his chin. Backstage, crew members stood shoulder to shoulder, silent. One of the backup dancers clasped his hands together and whispered, "He's healing." The choreographer nodded. "So are they." Out in the field, a group of journalists exchanged stunned looks. None of them took notes now. One simply said, "We can't print this right. It's bigger than words." Michael's voice cracked on a note, and instead of hiding it, he let it break. The imperfection made the audience gasp, then cheer. He could feel the difference. They weren't cheering the icon. They were cheering the man. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, eyes scanning the ocean of faces. There was no choreography guiding him anymore. Every motion was instinct, every breath an act of surrender. The spotlight followed, softer now, golden instead of white. From high above in the control booth, the director whispered to himself, "Keep the frame wide. Let the moment on the screen." The camera pulled back, capturing the entire stage. One man surrounded by darkness and light, an audience that seemed to glow from within. Michael took another breath, let it out slowly. His voice dropped to a whisper, carried by the sound system across the stadium. "Thank you for reminding me who I am." The orchestra faded into a gentle instrumental, a wash of strings and keys that sounded like morning after a storm. He lowered the microphone, stood perfectly still, eyes closed. The crowd didn't rush to clap this time. They just watched, breathing with him. A few rows back, a woman turned to her friend and said, "I feel like we just saw his soul." Her friend nodded, unable to answer. When the final chord dissolved, Michael looked upward. The lights caught the tears still on his cheeks, turning them into small stars. He whispered one last thing, too quiet for most to hear. "Love is louder than pain." The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in reverent thunder. He bowed deeply, not to the applause but the moment itself, then straightened and stood for a long time, just watching them, hand over his heart. Backstage, no one spoke for several minutes after he left the stage. One of the engineers removed his headset and said quietly, "That's going to change people." Another replied, "It already did." In the stands, the boy who had asked why Michael wasn't singing looked at his mother. "He looks happy now." She smiled, brushing his hair. "He does." Outside the stadium, reporters dictated hurried notes into recorders, their voices shaky. Tonight, at Wembley Stadium, Michael Jackson stopped the music, and the world stopped with him. The lights stayed dim for almost a full minute after he left the stage. No one moved. It felt like the end of a prayer that no one dared to break with applause. Then, as if released from a trance, people began to exhale. A wave of murmurs swept the arena, soft, confused, emotional. Some were crying openly, wiping their eyes with programs or sleeves. Others simply stood with their hands over their hearts, not sure what they had witnessed, but knowing it was something they would never forget. A cameraman on the lower riser kept filming even after the director had whispered, "Cut." He zoomed slowly across the crowd, capturing faces, young, old, black, white, every expression lit by the residue of what had just happened. When he played the footage back later, there would be a moment that made him stop, an old man in a blue jacket whispering. He gave it all away tonight. Up on the stage, technicians moved quietly, their boots clicking on the metal flooring. They unplugged instruments and coiled cables, speaking in hushed voices like people breaking down an altar. One of the sound engineers stared at the microphone Michael had dropped before exiting. It still glistened with moisture from his breath. "Don't wipe it," he said to the assistant, reaching for a cloth. "Leave it. It's history now." Outside the venue, the night air was cool and damp. Fans spilled into the streets, their voices low, as if they were leaving a memorial instead of a concert. A girl on someone's shoulders whispered, "Did you feel that?" It was like he saw us all at once. Her friend nodded. clutching her phone but unable to bring herself to watch the shaky video she'd recorded. "I don't think the camera got it," she said. "You had to be there." Back inside, Michael sat alone in his dressing room, the roar of the crowd replaced by the faint hum of the air conditioner. His jacket lay across a chair, the sequins catching the fluorescent light like tired stars. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, breathing slowly. The silence pressed against him again, but now it felt different, softer. He could still hear echoes of voices from the stadium. Those words, "We love you, Michael," they had sounded like forgiveness. He closed his eyes and saw flashes of the moment he'd broken down. The look on Emily's face, the shock in the audience, the sudden wash of empathy that had flooded the stage. He realized that the thing he had always feared most, imperfection, had given him back something he thought he'd lost. Humanity. A gentle knock came at the door. 5 minutes to debrief, his tour manager said quietly. Michael didn't answer right away. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The makeup was smudged, his eyes red, but there was a calm there he hadn't seen in years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I just want to remember how this feels." On the other side of the door, the crew gathered. No one dared to make jokes or small talk. A few minutes later, he emerged wearing a simple black sweater instead of the stage costume. The corridor lights reflected off the floor, and every crew member he passed instinctively moved aside, heads bowed in respect rather than protocol. He paused at the end of the hallway, looked back toward the stage, and smiled faintly. In the press area, journalists were still trying to put words to what they'd seen. He cried. One reporter said, "But it wasn't sadness. It was like he was releasing all of us." Another shook his head. "How do you even write about something like that? You can't measure it in quotes or set lists." A TV crew replayed a few seconds of the broadcast feed. The image of Michael standing motionless, tears glistening under the spotlight, froze on the monitor. The producer, normally all business, took off his headset and whispered, "Don't cut away." That's the truth right there. Far above the arena, in the nosebleed seats, a group of teenagers lingered. One of them, a boy with a band t-shirt too big for him, said, "I think that's what grown-ups mean when they talk about Grace." His friend laughed softly, wiping her face. "Grace." He nodded. "Yeah, like when somebody forgives the whole world at once." Meanwhile, Emily sat on the curb outside Gate 3, knees pulled to her chest, the broken sign folded in her lap. She could still feel the warmth of his hand. A small crowd had gathered around her, asking what he'd said, what it felt like, but she barely spoke. She just kept repeating, "He looked right at me." Eventually, people drifted away, leaving her alone beneath the sodium streetlights. She unfolded the sign and traced the glittery letters with her fingertip until the colors blurred. Then she whispered, "I'll be okay now," and smiled through the tears. Back inside, the crew finished packing the gear trucks. The youngest stagehand, a 19-year-old apprentice on his first world tour, lingered by the side of the stage. He pressed his palm to the floor where Michael had stood, as if trying to feel whatever was left there. "You don't see something like that twice," he murmured. By the time Michael's car pulled away from the arena, the streets were still full of fans. They clapped softly as the tinted windows passed, not out of hysteria but gratitude. Someone shouted, "Thank you for tonight," and a ripple of voices answered. Inside the car, Michael watched them through the glass, faces blurred by raindrops. He smiled gently and whispered, "No, thank you." The drive back to the hotel was quiet. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and blue. Inside, the silence was filled with the faint echo of his own words, "Love is louder than pain." He hadn't planned to say them. They had just appeared, like a message from some part of himself he'd forgotten. He repeated them again softly, testing the truth of them. The phrase felt real. When he reached the suite, he didn't turn on the lights. He opened the balcony doors and let the cool London air wash over him. From somewhere in the distance, he could still hear the crowd singing snippets of his songs. He leaned on the railing and looked up at the sky. The moon hung low and pale, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to be anywhere else. Down on the street, a group of fans held candles. They weren't chanting, just humming the melody he had improvised earlier that night. The sound floated upward, faint and trembling. Michael closed his eyes and let it reach him. Later, a journalist would write that the night at Wembley was the evening the myth turned back into a man. Another called it the concert where the world finally met Michael Jackson, the human being. But none of the articles captured what had actually happened, because what had happened couldn't be printed. It could only be felt, the shock of seeing someone drop the mask and discovering that what lay beneath was not weakness but light. In the early hours of the morning, long after the last fan had gone home, one of the cleaning staff found a small white glove on the stage floor. It was damp with sweat and sequins missing where the girl's tears had fallen. She picked it up carefully and placed it in a box marked "Do Not Discard." She didn't know why, only that it seemed important. A few days later, that glove would be displayed in a glass case at the next venue, unwashed, a quiet symbol of the night, when a superstar became a mirror for everyone watching. People would stop and stare at it before each show, whispering, "That's from Wembley." For Michael, that night didn't end when he left the stage. It stayed with him. In the days that followed, he felt a strange calm, a clarity that replaced the endless self-doubt. He rehearsed differently, less about perfection, more about feeling. During sound checks, he smiled at his crew more, laughed easily, even asked one of the engineers how his mother was doing. They noticed. At breakfast one morning, his assistant mentioned that the world was talking about Wembley. "They're calling a miracle," she said. Michael looked up from his tea and smiled faintly. "It wasn't a miracle," he said. "It was just the truth." Back in her small flat, Emily pinned a wrinkled sign to her wall. The glitter flaked off with every touch, but she didn't mind. Each missing speck felt like something released rather than lost. She wrote a note beneath it in pen. "He told me to live, so I will." Across the ocean, bootleg recordings of the moment began circulating online. People who hadn't been there watched and cried anyway. The clip ended with the words, "Love is louder than pain." Those 5 words became a quiet movement, printed on shirts, painted on murals, whispered at vigils. And though he never claimed them, Michael knew what they meant every time he heard them sung back to him. He had spent a lifetime mastering sound, rhythm, precision, but on that night in the heart of silence, he had rediscovered the one thing that had started it all, the human heartbeat. And as dawn broke over London, he finally slept, smiling faintly, the faint echo of the crowd still pulsing in his dreams, like the world itself breathing beside him. Morning crept over London in a pale silver hush. The streets outside Wembley were littered with confetti and paper cups, but there was a stillness that didn't feel like aftermath. It felt like reverence. Buses hissed past posters of Michael's face. The words history tore fading beneath the grime of night. In coffee shops and taxi queues, people spoke softly, replaying what they'd seen. A baker on Harrow Road turned on the small television behind his counter. The early morning news was looping the same clip. Michael Jackson standing motionless, eyes closed, tears streaking his cheeks. The anchor's voice trembled slightly. Last night's concert ended not with fireworks or choreography, but with silence, and a message the world can't stop repeating. Love is louder than pain. By noon, that sentence had crossed oceans. In Tokyo, a young woman on her commute watched the video on a subway monitor. She covered her mouth, tears rising without warning. In her bag was a resignation, letters she'd been carrying for weeks, too afraid to hand in. When she stepped off the train, she tore it in half and went to work smiling. In a hospital in Sao Paulo, a nurse on the night shift replayed the performance between patient rounds. An old man with oxygen tubes asked, "Why is everyone crying?" She told him softly, "Because he reminded us we still have hearts." The man reached for her hand, and for a moment the steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to sync with the rhythm of the concert's crowd. The footage spread faster than any single he had ever released. News anchors called it the Wembley Epiphany. Music critics called it the night the earth listened. But ordinary people didn't need labels. They shared it in cafes, classrooms, and living rooms. They didn't talk about pitch or choreography. They talked about the way their own chests had tightened when he'd said those words. In New York, A taxi driver played the clip on the tiny screen mounted on his dashboard. Traffic honked around him, but he sat through the red light staring. "Guys cry in front of 70,000 people," he muttered. "Takes guts." A passenger in the back nodded. Maybe that's what real strength looks like. They rode the rest of the way in silence. In a school in Kenya, students crowded around a teacher's old laptop. The internet was slow, the video blurry, but the sound was enough. When the children heard Michael whisper, "We all get hurt," they fell quiet. The teacher translated, his voice shaking. A girl in the back raised her hand. "Is he talking to us?" The teacher smiled. "Yes, to you. Back in London." Emily woke to the sound of her phone, buzzing nonstop. Her inbox was full, reporters, talk shows, strangers from around the world. They'd seen the grainy fan shot footage of her on stage. They wanted to know what he'd said, what it felt like. She read the messages slowly, still half in disbelief. Then she closed the phone and sat by the window. Outside, a group of children were chalking words on the pavement. "Love is louder than pain." She smiled through fresh tears. By afternoon, radio stations everywhere began playing his songs again, but differently, interwoven with sound bites from the concert. The transition between tracks was seamless. A snippet of the crowd whispering his name, followed by the opening chords of Heal the World. DJs stopped trying to sound cool. They spoke softly, like people at a memorial. One said, "Last night, pop music grew up." At a diner in Memphis, two men in their 60s watched the footage on a small television above the counter. One shook his head. "You see that? That's what Elvis tried to do at the end, reach people past fame." The other sipped his coffee. Guess the kid from Gary finished what the King started. Somewhere in a newsroom in Los Angeles, an editor assigned a feature story. "I don't want gossip," she told her team. "I want humanity. Write it like a miracle you almost don't believe." By sunset, the video had been played on every major network. In Times Square, the giant screens looped the moment of his bowed head. Crowds gathered, not screaming but quiet, as if in collective reflection. Street performers stopped mid-song. Cars slowed. A homeless man whispered. He cried for all of us. At the same time, halfway across the world in Mumbai, a film director paused editing to watch the clip on a colleague's phone. He turned to his crew. "We spend years making people feel for 2 hours. He did it in 10 seconds. That night, he rewrote the ending of his film to show kindness instead of revenge. Letters began to arrive at the headquarters of his foundation. Thousands of them. Some were addressed simply, "To the man who made me feel again." One came from a war nurse in Ukraine who said she had shown the clip to wounded soldiers and watched them cry without shame. Another came from a 12-year-old boy in Brazil who had bullied a classmate and now wrote, "I told him sorry today because Michael said love is louder." In churches, pastors quoted him from the pulpit. In mosques and temples, leaders spoke of compassion transcending fame. None of them mentioned his name directly. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. Back in London, Michael met quietly with his management team. They were buzzing with offers, interviews, talk shows, brand endorsements. He listened patiently, then shook his head. "No, this isn't about marketing," he said. "If people felt something real, we have to honor that." He spent the next morning writing. When his assistant peeked in, she saw dozens of sheets spread across the table. Sketches of ideas, names of hospitals, children's programs, charity contacts. At the top of one page, in bold handwriting, were 5 words: "Love is Louder Foundation." By the end of the week, the foundation was real. It started small, anonymous donations to children's hospitals, letters of encouragement sent to mental health charities. But word spread fast. Volunteers showed up in cities he'd never visited. Schools adopted the phrase as an anti-bullying campaign. Hospitals printed the words on posters above pediatric wards. Meanwhile, the music world buzzed. Other artists began dedicating songs to the message. At a concert in Paris, a rock singer stopped mid-set and told the crowd, "If Michael Jackson can cry on stage, then maybe we can all stop pretending we're bulletproof." The audience cheered until their throats ached. News outlets followed the ripple effect. Footage rolled of murals appearing overnight, one on a crumbling wall in Buenos Aires, showing Michael kneeling, hand outstretched toward a faceless crowd. Another in Berlin painted entirely in blue and gold with the words "Louder Than Pain" scrawled across it like a heartbeat. A reporter standing in front of one mural said into her microphone, "It's as if the world found a new anthem, not sung but felt." In small towns across America, community centers began playing his music during food drives and youth events. Organizers said attendance doubled. A volunteer in Detroit told a local station, "People show up because they want to be part of whatever started that night." Weeks later, the clip reached refugee camps through aid workers' phones. Children who didn't speak English mimicked the gesture, arms open wide, palms up, and chanted the phrase in their own languages. A journalist covering the camp wrote, "They don't know the words, but they understand the meaning." Inside his hotel room in Tokyo during the next leg of the tour, Michael watched footage of all this on a late-night news broadcast. Crowds around the world singing, holding candles, raising banners. He sat back, a quiet smile spreading across his face. He whispered to himself, "It's theirs now." At the Tokyo show, he changed the set list without warning. The crew panicked when he announced the new song order moments before going on stage. "Trust me," he said gently. When the lights dimmed and the crowd roared, he walked out wearing plain black instead of sequins. No pyrotechnics, no grand entrance. Just him. He raised a microphone, waited for silence, and said, "This next song isn't mine anymore, it belongs to you." Then he sang "Heal the World" slower than ever before, almost like a prayer. Tens of thousands lifted their voices with his, the stadium vibrating with harmony. By the time the song ended, there was no applause, only tears. The moment repeated itself city after city, language after language. In Johannesburg, he invited a children's choir from a local orphanage to join him on stage. In Manila, he stopped the show to thank the nurses who'd written him letters. In New York, he visited a children's hospital unannounced and played acoustic guitar for the kids. No cameras allowed. The gesture from Wembley had become something alive, moving through him, through them, through everyone who touched it. Months passed, but the world didn't move on. Every news cycle still found its way back to that moment at Wembley. The phrase "love is louder than pain" appeared on shirts, bracelets, posters, and classroom walls. It stopped being a slogan and started to sound like a heartbeat. In a radio station in Chicago, a DJ opened his midnight segment with confession. "I used to play love songs like they were background noise," he said on air. Then I saw him cry. "I realize we've all been background noise to someone, and we don't have to be." The phone lines lit up with callers. They told stories, reunions, apologies, promises. One said, "I called my mom for the first time in 5 years. I just wanted to say love you louder." In Paris, a photographer set up an exhibit titled "The Sound of Silence." The final image was a still from Wembley, Michael's silhouette surrounded by light. Beneath it, no caption, only a speaker looping the faint sound of breathing and a crowd holding its breath. Visitors stood before for minutes at a time, some crying without understanding why. On a street in Mexico City, a muralist painted children holding hands across continents. He was still finishing the final brushstrokes when an elderly woman stopped to watch. "Who are they?" she asked. He smiled. "Us, if we remember." In Johannesburg, the orphanage choir he had invited on stage founded a youth group called Louder Than Pain. They met every week to clean parks, feed neighbors, and sing. Their voices carried to the narrow streets, bright and untrained but full of joy. "We're just echoing him," their teacher said, smiling. But maybe he was echoing us first. Even governments took notice. In a quiet meeting in Geneva, UNICEF officials discussed new campaigns. One of them, a woman who had been in the Wembley crowd, said, "We spend millions trying to reach hearts." He did it with a whisper. "Maybe we should listen." Back in Los Angeles, Michael's team struggled to keep up. The foundation's donations tripled, then quadrupled. Schools requested his presence, but he refused interviews. He wanted the message to grow without the myth. He sent handwritten letters instead, short and steady. "Keep loving louder." He wrote to a school in Dublin. "Keep healing the world." To a hospital in Manila. Keep believing we can be better, to a refugee camp in Syria. He moved differently now, calm, deliberate, unhurried. In rehearsal, he smiled more. During performances, he lingered longer on the quiet moments, letting the audience sing entire choruses without him. When they did, he stood still, eyes closed, and listened. It sounded like forgiveness. At the same time, not everyone understood. Some critics accused him of turning vulnerability into theater, but even they couldn't deny the change around them. In New York, a protest turned peaceful when someone began playing Heal the World through a megaphone. The crowd that had been chanting angrily lowered its signs and started singing instead. Reporters on the scene called it the most beautiful confusion in history. In Rome, a priest ended his Sunday sermon with a clip from the concert. "This," he told his congregation, "is what it looks like when a man meets his purpose." In the back pew, a teenager closed her eyes and whispered the words to herself, not as prayer but as promise. Meanwhile, Michael avoided cameras. He told his team, "Let the world keep the moment purer," but he watched from afar. Late nights found him on the balcony of whatever hotel he was in, scrolling through videos fans sent him. Children singing, people hugging, strangers helping strangers. He smiled quietly. Sometimes he cried. One night in Rio, after another sold-out show, he walked alone along the beach. The moon painted the waves silver, and the city lights shimmered behind him. A group of street kids recognized him, but didn't rush over. They just waved and called out, "Obrigado, Michael." He waved back, laughing softly. One of the boys shouted, "Love is louder." The others joined in, their voices rising over the surf. He put his hand on his heart and called back, "Always." In that moment, surrounded by the simplest kind of gratitude, he understood the circle had closed. What he'd given had returned multiplied. Back home in California months later, his estate grounds were filled with letters and flowers from around the world. Tourists came not to gawk, but to thank. Volunteers from the foundation guided them gently, reminding them it wasn't a memorial but a movement. A mother from South Korea left a photo of her son beside a candle. "He used to be afraid of everything," she said. Then he saw the video. Now he sings. The foundation expanded faster than anyone expected. It funded music programs in poor neighborhoods, supplied instruments to schools, supported mental health hotlines. At every event, children recited the same 5 words before beginning. Love is louder than pain. Teachers said it had changed how kids treated one another. At a small concert in Detroit, a teenage choir performed one of Michael's songs. Before they started, their director told the crowd, "This is for the man who reminded us what music is for." When they finished, the audience stood in silence, then erupted into applause that felt like an echo from Wembley. Years later, sociologists would write papers about that period. They called it the Quiet Revolution, the moment kindness became contagious again. They traced its beginning back to one man's silence and one fan's tears. But for most people, it wasn't history. It was memory. In a classroom in Nigeria, a teacher asked the students to write about heroes. One girl wrote, "My hero is the man who told the world to love louder. He didn't fight wars. He just listened." Her paper went viral online. Michael saw it months later and smiled. As winter came, he announced a special concert, just one, broadcast worldwide, proceeds to global aid. The stage design was simple, a ring of light and a single microphone. During rehearsals, crew members asked what the finale would be. He said, "Nothing special, just the truth." When the night arrived, millions watched. He opened not with fireworks, but with stillness. The camera zoomed close on his face. "A long time ago," he said softly, "someone cried and I heard her. Tonight, I want to thank her and all of you for teaching me that love isn't just a word. It's a choice we make every day." The lights expanded to reveal children from every continent holding candles. They began singing Heal the World in dozens of languages at once. The sound was imperfect, beautiful, and real. Michael joined them, not as the lead, but as one voice among many. The camera panned outward until the stage looked like a small island of light in an ocean of darkness. Around the world, People watching from homes, cafes, hospitals, and prisons began lighting their own candles, mirroring the image. Satellites caught it from space, tiny sparks glowing across continents. When the song ended, he whispered again, "Love is louder than pain," and lowered the microphone. The broadcast cut to silence, then images of people everywhere hugging, singing, crying. It wasn't an ending. It was continuation. Afterward, social media flooded with messages. I called my sister. I forgave my father. I smiled at a stranger. The words all ended the same way. Love louder. Later that night, Michael sat backstage, still in his plain black shirt. A stagehand approached, nervous. "Sir, the world's talking about you again." He smiled, shaking his head. "No," he said quietly. "They're talking about us." He stepped outside into cool air. The city beyond the arena shimmered with candlelight in windows, on sidewalks, in hands. The stars above looked closer somehow, as if the sky itself had leaned in to listen. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and felt the hum of life vibrating through everything. The same hum he'd felt on stage that night at Wembley, but now magnified until it filled the whole earth. Somewhere a child was singing his words. Somewhere a stranger was forgiving another. Somewhere someone was choosing love louder. And as he stood there, quietly smiling beneath the same moon that had watched him in London, Michael realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't have to perform anymore. The song was already singing itself through the world. He turned toward the stars, whispered a thank you no one heard, and walked back inside, his shadow stretching long behind him, merging with the light spilling from the doorway. Proof that even when the music fades, the echo of kindness never does. The planet moved on its axis, as if the song itself had become gravity. Weeks turned into months, and the world didn't forget. Cities that usually swallowed feelings whole began to wear them in the open, in subway tunnels, on ferries, in the dirty glass of bus shelters. People saw their own faces a little differently, as if some hidden light beneath the skin had been turned back on. In a kitchen in Dublin, a woman with dishwater up to her wrists looked out the window at her son playing football in the rain. He slipped, fell, and for a second she saw the storm of frustration that always came when he didn't get it perfect. She tapped the window and called to him, "It's all right, love, louder than pain, remember?" He laughed, shook his soaked hair, and kept playing. In a barbershop in Detroit, a man kept a faded printout taped to the mirror, a still image of the Wembley bow, head bent in the light. Between fades and lineups, customers would stare at it longer than they meant to, as if listening to a silent chorus only they could hear. A boy climbed into the chair and asked, "Mister, why bow like that?" The barber brushed clippings from the cape and said, "Because sometimes you don't fight the world, you thank it." In a quiet corner of a Tokyo park, a young woman stood beneath ginkgo trees, gold leaves falling around her like slow rain. She held a letter she'd never thought she could write. "Dear Dad, I forgive you." She didn't send it yet, but she whispered the words out loud, and they didn't break her. Far away, on a narrow street in Naples, a baker pulled warm loaves from an oven and set them steaming in the window. He saw a kid with big eyes staring hungrily through the glass and didn't think twice. He walked outside, placed a loaf in the boy's arms, and said, "For you, Piccolo." When the boy stammered grazie, the baker shrugged. "Love is louder," he said in rough English, and the boy nodded like he'd been taught a spell. Michael read stories like these in the quiet hours, the messages forwarded by his team, the clippings slid under his door. He didn't keep a scrapbook. He let the moments pass through him, like music that didn't have to be recorded to be real. He still rehearsed, still wrote, still worked until sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. But he moved to a slower tempo, one the body could carry without breaking. He said yes to fewer things, and meant them more. A morning in Los Angeles. He walked into the foundation office without the usual advance call. The staff startled, coffee cups midair, phones half-dialed. He smiled small and calm, and asked if he could make some calls. They led him to an empty conference room. He closed the door and dialed a list with names scribbled in the margins: a pediatric ward in Manila, a youth shelter in Cleveland, a music program in Lagos. When a nurse in Manila picked up, she gasped and held the phone against her chest. "It's him," she whispered to a colleague, then said into the receiver, "Do you know how many children sing you to their four poles?" He laughed gently, thanked her for proving that courage has tiny hands, and asked what they needed. When she said more headphones, more recorders, more ways to drown out the machines with songs, he nodded as if she could see him. "You'll have them," he said, and she believed him because he said it like a promise he'd already kept. At night, when the city quieted and the stars were brave enough to be seen, he would sit with an acoustic guitar and play fragments that never became full songs. Threads of melody he let wander until they found their way back to silence. Sometimes the silence felt like another instrument, the one he had finally learned to trust. He could hear Wembley in that silence, the crowd's breath, the one heartbeat stretched across 100,000 bodies, and the way a single whispered sentence could move like wind through a forest. Love is louder than pain. On a winter evening in New York, the snow fell in soft pages that didn't quite stick. The sidewalks were damp without drama. A woman in a red coat hurried past a man sleeping against a shuttered deli, then slowed, then stopped. She took off her scarf and placed it around his neck, and when he woke with start, she held up both hands. "It's okay." He blinked, surprised. "Why?" She didn't have an answer big enough. "I heard something," she said, "a while back. It's still ringing." In Chicago, a choir director in a public high school watched her kids laugh at each other during warm-ups. The old armor of joking that had feared being heard. She tapped the music stand hard enough to skew the pencils inside the cup. "Listen," she said, "this is not about pretty. This is about true." She told him the story of Wembley without embellishment. He stopped the whole planet to feel something. We can stop a room. The next chord they sang was ragged and bright and perfect in its wrongness, and several of them burst into embarrassed tears and tried to pretend they hadn't. And she let them, because the song had already done its work. In a newsroom in Nairobi, a reporter typed an opinion piece and deleted it and typed it again. He had written about famine, corruption, war. He could summon horror in 4 lines and policy in 2. But this was different. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered the clip where the music dropped and the man stood in silence and did not fall. He began again. Sometimes a single act rearranges the furniture of the heart. He filed it without worrying whether it would trend. The foundation's small acts kept accumulating until they weren't small. A city council in Sao Paulo passed a motion to fund after-school arts because someone read a letter in Chambers about a boy who had stopped fighting when he started drumming. A hospital in Seoul painted a mural of hands opening like wings above the pediatric ward and hung headphones at every bed. In a town in West Virginia where the mine had closed and the only store still open sold lottery tickets, a community center turns back room into a studio with secondhand equipment stamped with a tiny logo, a heart and a sound wave. The kids who once tagged the overpass with curses sprayed louder instead, and it somehow meant the same thing and the opposite. He traveled less and wrote more. Not just songs. Notes on napkins. Letters he kept in a drawer. A list titled things I wish I'd known sooner, which began 1. You cannot outdance loneliness. 2. The smallest kindness remembers forever. 3. A whisper can move a mountain more gently than a shout. Spring laid green across cities that had been gray, and a new concert took shape. Not a tour, not a spectacle, a gathering. The invite went out quietly. 1 night only. Proceeds of a movement that no longer needed a name because the words had already traveled farther than logistics ever could. The set was simple. A circle stage. Candles banked at the edge like constellations dropped to floor level. A walkway that threaded into the crowd and didn't end on a platform but in a gap where a single person could pass. The night of the broadcast, cameras found everything without being told. They found a girl in Nairobi clutching her grandmother's hand, a paramedic in Toronto watching from the back of an ambulance between calls, a soldier in Thessaloniki with earbuds under his helmet and his rifle slung low, a woman in Seoul holding a newborn whose head fit entirely in her palm. None of them were labeled. All of them were seen. He walked out without fanfare. No exploding pyro, no pop of smoke. The sound that rose to meet him was gentle, the kind of cheer that sounds like people standing when a bride enters and someone's grandmother is already crying. He stood in the center of the light and let the camera come close enough that the lines at the edges of his eyes were a map and not a flaw. "Thank you for tonight," he said, voice low, breath condensed briefly in the cool. "And thank you for every night I didn't know you were there, loving me louder than I knew how to love myself." Behind him, the candles shivered and held. He sang the way people talk to someone they trust in the kitchen at 2 a.m., voice soft, off the leash of perfection, choosing meaning over shine. The first chorus belonged to him. By the second, it belonged to everyone. The choir that joined him wasn't famous. It was the orphanage from Johannesburg, the public school from Chicago, a church group from Busan, the youth center from Detroit, a line of kids from Dublin who'd taken a double-decker for the first time and couldn't stop looking up. They missed entrances and created new harmonies by accident. He laughed on Mike once when a boy came in early, and the boy clapped a hand to his mouth and then kept singing louder. Midway through, he walked the narrow path into crowd. Hands reached and then pulled back, learning the difference between wanting and taking. He stopped to lift a candle that had guttered and cupped his palm until flame found itself again. He handed the candle to a woman whose mouth made a startled oh and then a yes. On a monitor in a city he would never see, someone watching on a couch lifted a tea light to mirror the screen, and somewhere else, thousands of elsewheres, people did the same. From above, satellites saw dots of light taking shape, like a new kind of constellation that spelled nothing a telescope could read, but everything a heart could. He paused at the end of the walkway, exactly where the platform used to be in other shows, and sat on the edge like a kid at a lake, sneakers braced on the lower rail. He looked out the crowd and did something most performers never risk. He asked a question he didn't script. What did love make you do this year? For a second there was a paralysis of being called on in class. Then someone shouted, "I called my mom." Another, "I forgave myself." Another, "I got clean." Another, voice breaking, "I stayed." The answers tumbled over one another until they were a single sound bigger than any chorus he had ever written. The final song didn't have a title. It began with a hum, the way water begins under ice, and it rose until it found a note that seemed already there in the room waiting to be named. He didn't conduct, he listened. The mic slipped from his hand to his lap, and his hands rose empty, palms open, like he was both offering and receiving. The camera caught his eyes as they filled, not with collapse now, but with the kind of tears that don't break you, the kind that release what you were never meant to hold alone. When the last note dissolved, he didn't bow right away. He let the quiet come, and when it did, it was not the hush of shock but completion, like a book closing on a page everyone can find again without a bookmark. He said the sentence that followed him like a loyal shadow since London, and it sounded new and older than language at the same time. Love is louder than pain. He didn't add anything to it. He didn't need to. Backstage afterward, the night smelled like sweat and candle wax. People hugged longer than usual. The stagehands who usually joked about the loadout didn't. They coiled cable like rosary beads. He sat for a moment alone on a road case, elbows on knees, staring at the scuffed floor. He could feel the way the building was still buzzing, like a bell after the strike. Outside, the city sang itself to sleep. Apartment windows glowed one by one, and in more than a few of them, a small light burned on a table or by a framed photo or next to a hospital bed. In a basement in Warsaw, a teenager who had never left her city traced the curve of a treble clef on notebook paper and wrote lyrics she would show no one yet. In a farmhouse in Montana, a man who drove too fast on back roads and kept secrets in his glove box took the bottle from the cabinet and set it back without opening it, then walked outside and watched his breath and said out loud to no one, "Okay." He kept working. The foundation hired more staff, but not to write press releases, to answer letters. They cataloged the stories without ranking them. A woman got a tattoo of the waveform of those 5 words. A prison library added his albums and a stack of blank journals under a sign, "Write it down instead." A group of nurses in Manila formed a choir and recorded a single for their patients. It sounded like halos made of cotton. A classroom in Rio wrote a play where the villain was silence and the hero was a candle, and the candle didn't fight the silence. It warmed it until it changed shape. He did not take credit for any of it. When asked in the rarest of interviews what he thought about starting a movement, he smiled the way people do when the question misses the point. I didn't start anything, he said quietly. I heard it. I let it through. The interviewer nodded, as if that were a lyric, and maybe it was. The years didn't stop. Time did what time does, careened, drifted, stole, gave back. But in the slipstream of news that comes and goes like weather, the night at Wembley remained, and not the spectacle, but the stillness. People returned to the clip the way you return to a place where something good happened, to make sure it was real and to borrow its light. On the anniversary, candles appeared without anyone declaring a vigil. In the Philippines, faint singing threaded streets after dark. In Madrid, a crowd in a square fell silent at midnight by shared habit, as if obeying a law only the heart could pass. In a hospital in Lagos, a nurse told a new colleague, "We dim the lights for 1 minute, once a year, because once he did it for us for longer than that, even if he didn't know our names." The night before another concert, smaller, always smaller now, he found himself alone in a rehearsal hall. The mirrors along one wall made the room look like 1,000 rooms. He didn't turn on the playback. He walked to the center and stood still and listened for the ghost of the count in that wasn't there because tonight didn't need it. He thought of the boy he had been, pressed into brilliance, and the man he had become, freed into gentleness. And he blessed both of them with a mercy he wished someone had offered sooner. He was, by any measure the world could invent, the greatest to ever do it. And yet the greatest thing he had ever done was stop. He closed his eyes and saw her again. Not the footage, not the silhouette, but the real face, the smudged glitter, the way her mouth had shaped the word thank. He whispered back into the empty room, "You're welcome," and then softer, because the truth deserves saying twice, "Thank you." He walked out under a sky, so clear the stars seemed like holes punched in velvet with light leaking through. Somewhere far off a siren wailed, and then was gone. His breath clouded and faded. He tucked his hands into his jacket and headed toward the door where voices waited. Crew, family, strangers who felt like neither. He moved at a human pace. The door swung open. Warmth spilled out, and he stepped into it. The room on the other side of the door smelled of coffee, candle wax, and flowers from somewhere far away. People turned as he entered, not because of fame, but because of presence. He moved quietly, shaking hands, embracing those who reached for him with a kind of grace that didn't need announcement. His assistant whispered, "They're all waiting." He nodded. Then let's not make them wait any longer. He stepped into the small press room. Cameras clicked, flashes flared, but they faded fast. His calm smothered frenzy. He stood behind the microphone and rested both hands on the edge of the podium. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence filled with heartbeat and breath and reverence. "I used to think the loudest thing in the world was applause," he said finally, "but it's not. It's a sound that comes right after, when people are listening." He smiled gently. "You've all been listening. Thank you. No speechwriters. No teleprompter. Just a man with too much history, and not enough time speaking from somewhere deep and simple. What happened that night wasn't about me," he said. "It was about us, about remembering we belong to each other, that every stage is a kind of world, and every world deserves a song." A journalist in the front row lowered her camera and forgot to take notes. She would later write, "He didn't perform that day. He testified. He ended it the way he always did now, without flourish. Keep singing," he said softly, "even if no one claps. Especially then." Outside, the day had turned to a kind of afternoon that looks like forgiveness. Sunlight hazy through city dust, colors softer, sirens slower. Reporters packed up without shouting questions. One lingered by the curb and said quietly, "He's different now." Another replied, "No, maybe we finally are." He left through a side door, taking no entourage, just a car and quiet. As they drove, he rolled down the window and let the wind undo the careful styling of his hair. The driver asked if he wanted the radio on. He nodded. The station was playing an old recording, his voice young, raw, unscarred. He listened without nostalgia, only gratitude, mouthing along, barely audible, "I remember him." They crossed a bridge, and he watched the water below catching light, like applause scattered across the surface. "Pull over," he said suddenly. The driver hesitated, then obeyed. Michael got out, walked to the railing, and looked down. The river was wide and slow, brown in places where the sun couldn't reach. He closed his eyes and breathed. Every city he'd ever played in, every crowd, every note. Somehow it all ran through that river now, joining something larger than sound. When he got back in, he smiled. Just needed to hear the world, he said, and the driver didn't understand but nodded anyway. That evening, at a small cafe tucked between gray London buildings, a television above the counter replayed the speech. Customers barely looked up at first. Then, one by one, they stopped eating, stopped talking, and listened. When he said, "Keep singing," the old man stirring sugar into his tea whispered, "All right, son, we will." The camera panned his face before fading out. A boy at a corner table pointed and said, "Mom, he looks like he's glowing." His mother smiled. "Maybe he finally is." In the weeks that followed, the world adjusted around the quiet. The media frenzy ebbed, but the movement didn't die. It matured. People didn't chant anymore. They acted. A retired mechanic in Cleveland taught neighborhood kids guitar. A surgeon in Cairo paid the hospital bills for patients who couldn't afford them. A group of teenagers in Warsaw started leaving handwritten notes in library books. Simple phrases like "you matter" and "love louder." Someone in Manila painted those same words on a bridge pillar, and by dawn, commuters were stopping to take pictures. One morning, a letter arrived at the foundation from a small town in Indiana. It was written in careful cursive by a teacher named Mrs. Owens. "We held our talent show last night." It read, "A little boy sang 'Climb Every Mountain.' He stood on a box because he couldn't reach the microphone. When he finished, everyone cried. I thought you'd like to know." He read the letter twice, smiled slowly, and said under his breath, "Full circle." He sent the boy a note the same week. "You stood on that box for all of us. Keep climbing." The boy framed it without fully understanding why it mattered yet. One day he would. Years blurred. The tour ended. The foundation grew into something that didn't need his name on it anymore. That was how he wanted it. He began to disappear in the best way. Less a man, more a melody people carried without realizing. His appearances became rarer. But whenever he did surface, at a children's ward, a shelter, a quiet benefit dinner, the air seemed to soften around him. He aged gently, like light through curtains. The glitter gave way to linen, the platform shoes to soft sneakers. His laughter stayed young, his eyes older. There were still rumors, still critics, still those who couldn't let legends be human. But they faded under the weight of what he'd left behind. The noise no longer reached him. He was listening to something quieter now. On the 20th anniversary of Wembley, a global event was announced. Not by him, but by those he'd inspired. Every major city pledged 1 minute of silence at the same hour. No broadcasts, no performances, no hashtags. Just stillness. When the hour came, traffic stopped. Airplanes delayed takeoff. In hospitals, doctors paused between shifts. In prisons, guards unlocked rec rooms so inmates could stand together. Satellites photographed the Earth during that minute. Less noise, less light, more blue. In his California home, he stood on the balcony with a mug of tea, eyes closed. He didn't want to be on camera. He just wanted to feel it. The world going quiet again, not in mourning but in unity. When the minute ended, he whispered, "I can rest now." But he didn't stop creating. There was always another melody, another spark of sound waiting to be shaped. He wrote songs in notebooks, on napkins, on the backs of envelopes. Most would never be released. They were meant for him alone, a diary in harmony. One afternoon, he recorded a demo by himself, just voice and piano. No reverb, no mix, just truth. The lyrics were simple. If love is the only sound that stays, then let me be its echo. He never played it for anyone. But years later, a studio intern would find the tape and quietly leak it online. It would go viral, not because it was perfect, but because it felt like a benediction. In time, Michael's public life became quieter still. Interviews grew shorter, appearances rarer. But the world he'd shaped kept vibrating. Teachers taught with more gentleness. Crowds at concerts cheered less for chaos and more for connection. People who'd never met him spoke about him as if he'd been there in small moments, a look between strangers, a song hummed while holding someone's hand in the hospital, a whisper passed from parent to child. He once said to a close friend, "If they remember me at all, I hope it's not for the moonwalk. I hope it's for the pause after." And they did. Years later, on the night of his passing, candles appeared again, billions this time. Not just for mourning, but for gratitude. Radio stations around the world synchronized to play his message. Love is louder than pain. The planet glowed from orbit, a ring of light circling the dark. Astronauts on the International Space Station reported hearing faint music through the static, though science couldn't explain it. One said, maybe the Earth was singing him home. But what truly mattered was what remained. Foundations, schools, and small acts carried on quietly. A boy somewhere still stood on a box to reach the microphone. A nurse still hummed his melody under her breath while changing bandages. The world kept its promise. In Gary, Indiana, the old elementary school held a small ceremony. No media, just locals. The janitor's grandson, who now worked there himself, found a wooden Coca-Cola crate in storage. He placed it on the stage where a plaque read, May 15th, 1963, the night the world met a legend. They set a single candle on top. The wax melted slowly down the sides, pooling in the grooves of the old wood. One of the teachers whispered. The flame never went out. It just traveled. In Tokyo, a mural stretched across the side of a hospital. Michael's silhouette with a child holding his hand, both dissolving into starlight. Below it, in Japanese, the same words echoed across decades. Ai wa Tamayoriuki, love is louder than pain. And somewhere in a concert archive, the Wembley footage still played. The tear, the silence, the phrase that changed everything. New generations found it and felt the same shiver through their ribs. It didn't matter that the image was grainy or that the sound crackled. The truth survived technology. In the end, history would write many things about Michael Joseph Jackson, prodigy, innovator, icon. But the truest story wasn't about fame. It was about a 5-year-old boy on a box who climbed higher than anyone thought possible, and the man he became who finally learned that the greatest stage is the human heart. And if you listened carefully, through the applause, through the noise, through the turning of years, you could still hear it. The sound that started everything. A single voice, trembling but sure, whispering to the world one last time. Love is louder than pain. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.